with us. What we're going to be doing here in just a second is that these gentlemen are going to be doing a musket demonstration. And one of the reasons they do this is because we still get a common question of why in the world do they fight that way? Why in the 18th century do we have a bunch of guys, usually in bright coats, staying in a giant line out in the open, and it almost looks like they're taking turns shooting back and forth? Well, there's actually very much a rhyme and reason as to why they fight that way. Bottom line up front is that the weapon these guys are carrying, that is the latest and greatest technology of the 18th century. So basically what that thing can and cannot do, it's going to dictate the formations they use and the tactics they use on these battlefields. So hopefully by the end of this demonstration, you'll get an idea of how these things work, how they use them, and hopefully that'll give you a bigger idea of why they fight that way in the 18th century. Before we get to the weapons though, I gotta talk about what kind of soldiers we have here, specifically at this battle at Guilford Courthouse. To break it down, you really have two generic types of soldier. You have professionals, and then you have militia. So the militia are probably the most numerous type of soldier here. There are more militiamen than there are continentals. There are more militiamen on this battlefield than there are British regulars. What makes a militiaman unique is that he is not a professional because that is not his job. He has a normal job that he does throughout the day. And maybe once every few months he will serve in the militia, and when he serves for about 3 months at a time. And when he practices, he does not practice every day, does not practice every week, does not practice every month. They at most will muster every 3 months. The next problem with that is that depending on the militia company you're in will dictate how serious you take it. Some militia companies get together and they really take it seriously. Some militia companies get together and they use it as an excuse to go drinking. So that's why you're going to have a little bit of different performance from these guys on this battlefield. The other thing to consider is that they bring all their own gear to the battlefield. Militiamen do not have a uniform, so when you see militia portrayed in movies or out, if you ever see them out here doing demonstrations, they have no rhyme or reason to their clothing because they just wear whatever they have. They also have to bring their own weapons to the battlefield, and typically when they bring those to the battlefield, they have an edged weapon of some sort, but they usually do not have bayonets. We're going to talk about what a bayonet is and what that does in just a second. I hope that gives you an idea of what a militiaman is. Basically, he's what we would call the citizen soldier. He's doing it part-time, but most of the time, he's actually doing something else. He's a farmer, trapper, tinsmith, shopkeeper, something. Then we get to the professionals. These guys are professionals. The United States Army also had professionals here. They're called the Continentals. Does anybody know what color the American professionals wore?
Blue.
Blue.
Wow.
Yes. Typically they wanted to wear blue, but we do have one unit here that is wearing brown because the United States Army isn't always the best supplied army. They try and make do with whatever they can get their hands on. So ideally, everybody should be wearing blue coats, but at this battle, the 2nd Maryland is wearing brown because that was what they could get a hold of. But they are still professionals. Professional meaning they signed a contract one day, and that became their job for the next several years. They train every day, they march around a lot, do chores in camp, they get yelled at by their NCOs and officers, but over that lots of practice, they're going to get better and better, and over their many years of service, they're going to be in a few battles, and all that practice and all that experience combined to make them professionals, make them very good at what they do. And we get to these guys. These guys are also professionals, and what is the most generic term we generally think of when we see these soldiers?
Redcoat.
Redcoats, right? And that's because they also have uniforms. Typically they are wearing red here, but not all soldiers in the British Army will be wearing red. We do have some units that will wear green, stuff like that. We have some Hessians who are on this battlefield. They're also wearing blue. That will cause some confusion in one part of the battle. But to give you an idea, same thing. These guys signed a contract one day. This became their day-to-day job. They practice a lot. They have a lot of training. They've been in several battles. So all that combines to make them very good, very proficient at what they do. But now, let's get to what they're carrying and why they are fighting the way they do. And so would somebody like to step forward and please explain to us what exactly is a smoothbore and how it works?
Good morning. My name is Colin Carter, and before you is the 7th Regiment of Royal Fusiliers. And the 7th Regiment, specifically Lieutenant Lestrange's company, fought here at Guilford Courthouse. They were a 19-man detachment that marched north with General Cornwallis, and those men did not fight in the Battle of Cowpens, where the regiment is most famous from. The regiment was captured for the most part, but the detachment that was here at Guilford Courthouse and what you see before us was here with General Cornwallis's army and fought here at the Battle of Courthouse and would go on to fight for the rest of the Carolina campaign and into Virginia. And I'm dressed here as a private soldier in the Royal Fusiliers, and I carry a roughly 10-pound smoothbore musket. This is the standard British Army infantry firearm of the period. It fires a 75 caliber ball. and has a max effective range of about 300 yards. Typically, though, you would not start engaging an enemy formation out into about 250 yards, and really you would have what's called sustained firefights and firing by volleys, by platoons or battalions, up until you get to about 75 yards. And once you get into 75-yard range, you employ what's called the bayonet. And this is a 17-inch tool designed not necessarily to kill you, but to encourage you to leave, because the practice of 18th century warfare isn't necessarily to destroy the enemy army. It's to conduct maneuver operations to force your adversary to leave key terrain, and then once you occupy key terrain, force them into an unfavorable situation that will either force them to retreat or surrender. And that's the purpose of the bayonet. It's a psychological weapon. It's designed to invoke fear and to just get you away from the battlefield. And here at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, you have one of the very few rarities in 18th century combat where two regiments, the 2nd Battalion, Brigade of Guards, and the 1st Maryland Regiment of the Continental Army actually clashed in a head-on bayonet charge. And to be honest, the 1st Maryland got the better end of the Guards that day. The 2nd Battalion Guards sustained 90% casualties, and their brigade went from 2 to 1 battalions after this fight. The American Army, by this point in the war, was very proficient in the use of the bayonet, and you have at this battle some of the most elite and veteran units of both armies, because you've got to remember that by 1781, you have approximately 6 years of combat, and both armies are relatively veterans, both armies are seasoned, and both armies know how to fight. And so the ability to use the bayonet, to employ your weapon systems, to do command and control and such, both armies are really at their peak at this fight. And it really is a very narrow British victory at the end of the day. In addition to the weapon, I'm carrying 28 rounds of ammunition in my cartridge box, which is preserved from the weather elements by a flap. I have an additional 30 rounds in my knapsack, which weighs about 30 to 40 pounds. A modern soldier in the modern United States Army will carry between 50 to 60 pounds of gear. In the 18th century, the British soldier and the Continental adversary also carried between 50 and 60 pounds. On a side note, the average weight of a Roman legionnaire was between 50 and 60 pounds. It's about what the average human being can sustain and carry through him on the campaign. In addition to my knapsack, I have what's called a haversack. This carries my food, bread, cheese, my dining equipment. I have a canteen, and then I have in my knapsack 2 spare shirts, an extra pair of stockings, but the majority of what I own, I am carrying with me. And then those things that I don't own are in what's called the baggage train, which at this point in time is several miles away. And the British Army and the Continentals, by this point in the war, were a very mobile force. They didn't carry a lot of extra baggage. They didn't have tents. They didn't have ironware and such that you would have in garrison. That stuff existed, but when you're out here on campaign, you're moving quick, you are trying to catch your enemy force, to bring them to battle, and to do that effectively, you've got to be able to move fast. So, with that, I'll turn it over to the park ranger, and we'll carry on. Thank you.
So, to conceptualize combat in the 18th century, what you got to think about is that it's not so much about the individual soldier kind of maneuvering around in the terrain, firing his weapon, working in small squads. You got to think of it almost as though an entire battalion is one giant weapon system. It's moved around together. It ideally would attack the same opposing unit. And the way they're going to fight, as he mentioned, was in volleys. Either the entire group can volley, companies, divisions, but generally it's not individuals firing as fast as possible by themselves. And the idea was you took your unit, you marched it up to about 60 to 80 yards away from your opponent, and then you started firing volleys. And hopefully after a while you're going to see the opposing line either punching holes in it or it looks like they're about to waver, and that's when they would use, as he showed you, the bayonet. And he explained it perfectly. It's more of a psychological weapon. Hopefully you've weakened the enemy so much the mere sight of an entire line of guys coming at them would cause them to break and flee off the battle. Now the whole reason they fire in volleys is that they're essentially trying to overcome some of the shortcomings of this weapon. Now one thing that you notice about it is that it's an extremely long weapon. So first of all, ideally, if you want to fire as fast as possible, you need to be standing. I mean, you could load that and fire that thing kneeling or lying down, but it would make the process a whole lot harder. The other thing about this weapon is that it is a smooth bore, which means the inside of the bore is smooth like a pipe. There's no rifling like modern weapons. And the ball that goes in it is just slightly smaller than the diameter of the barrel. Now, what those two factors mean is that when that ball comes out, it doesn't have a stable flight pattern nor a predictable flight pattern. If it rattles around in that weapon and moves even a ½ degree as it exits the muzzle, the farther and farther it flies, the farther and farther off course it'll go from where you intended it to. If it goes a ½ degree from to the left or the right, by the time it's traveled about 100 yards, it could go up to 2 feet off of your point of aim. So if you cannot predict the exact spot your ball is going, what you do is you get everybody to fire all at once. Essentially what you're doing are throwing clouds of bullets at the enemy and hoping somebody hits something. So that's how they fought back then, but even in these battles in particular, ideally, the British did not want to get in prolonged firefights with the Americans, especially with the militia. They know they can't stand up to them in hand-to-hand combat, so what they typically like to do is fire 1 or 2 grand volleys or sharp volleys and then charge in and make them flee. So it's something to consider about why the way they fight the way they do. They're essentially working around what these weapons can and cannot do. And we do have rifles in this era, but the big problem with a rifle for this era is that it is also a muzzle loader, which means all their ammunition has to be put in through the end of the weapon. And with a rifle, to get that rifling to grip that ball and spin it like a football when it comes out of the weapon and give it a stable flight pattern, has to have a tight fit. That tight fit is going to slow down the loading process. You'll see when these guys load, they can pretty much just throw the rammer in and pushes everything down nice and easy. For a rifle, you would pretty much have to fight the ball all the way down to get it to seat. That's going to slow down the process. And so while these guys, professional soldiers, well-trained, can typically get probably 3 or 4 shots off every minute, riflemen's probably only getting 1. And then you come back to those militiamen who do not have the same experience or practice. Realistically, we should probably expect them to fire 2-3 times a minute. So that gives you an idea of the rate of fire, what these weapons are capable of, and why they're using it that way. So before I hand it over and these guys fire 2 shots for you, first one's going to be a by the numbers. So they'll do it step by step, the way they would have been trained, just so you can see the long, ridiculous process it takes to load and fire a single bullet. The second shot will be the more realistic, just going straight through the loading process and firing it off. But before I do that, before I hand it over, does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far? All right, so if there's no questions then, what I will do is I will give you one necessary warning I have to give before all demonstrations. As you can imagine, these are guys are firing guns. Guns use gunpowder. Gunpowder is explosive. It's going to be loud. So when they get to the point and they bring the weapon down, that's when they're about to fire. And I would encourage you all to plug your ears at that point. With that being said, they're all yours.
And Sodium, fire off. To the right about, face. Take to the prime end, load. Handle, cartridge. Prime, pan. Shut, pan. Out. Charge with cartridge. Draw your rammer. Ram down, cartridge. Return your rammer. Make ready. Present. Fire! Prime load.
Was that right? Yeah. Pretty sure the deer in the woods there are gone. They moved over to Lawndale.
Make ready.
That's pretty fast reload.
Present.
Yeah.
Fire! Jodio, fire off. To the right about, face. Take care to fix bayonet. Fix your bayonet. Jodio, pylons. Charge your bayonet.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 7th Regiment.
Arm. Unfix your bayonet.
so that concludes our demonstration, but I encourage you, if you have any other questions, please do come up to the rep and feel free to ask these guys anything about their weapons, their clothes, about the British Army. Any questions you got, please feel free to come up and ask.
Thank you.